Amongst ancient trees, so thick they block out much of the sun, a pair of halflings roam the forest floor. They laugh at old songs and dumb jokes as they search for fat berries and ripe apples, bit for a delicious pie for the evening festival. Their carefree attitude belies the dangers of the woods, the dense trees hiding all manners of dangers, from striges to trolls. But the halflings are experienced rangers with their ears to the wind, hoping that the daylight will keep most of the monsters at bay. As the last berry fills their basket, the joyful laughter dies at the echoing rapid thuds resonating through the woods. Coming closer and closer. Quickly the sound of splintering wood and torn brush makes the halflings reach for their weapons, for it is already too late to run. They are being hunted. Older editions of Dungeons & Dragons are known for having some truly bizarre monsters. While many original monsters have a connection, no matter how tenuous, to real-world mythologies, eventually a home setting becomes so well developed that original monsters start filling the unique niches that are still out there in the setting. And there is no niche that is more unique than hunting the quick folk. A cross between a gorilla and a jack-o'-lantern with some arms glued on. The origin of the phrase, he got mouthed. The halfling's bane? Let's talk about the tall mouther. So what am I talking about? In this episode, first we're going to cover what is a tall mouther. Next, we'll dive into its origins and try to figure out what the heck this thing is and where it came from. After that, we'll explore how I rebuilt the tall mouther for the 2024 edition of D&D and how they fare in combat. And then we'll close out with some ideas about how to add the tall mouther not only as a monster of the week, but as part of an ongoing campaign. When I opened the page on the strange blue gorilla with 4 arms, I knew the party where my wife and her cousin, both playing halflings, was just begging to have to deal with this monstrosity. Or, to be more accurate, this aberration. The tall mouther's first and sadly only appearance was in the monster compendium Monsters of Faerun, one of the very early books for the 3rd edition of D&D, and the first monster book that came out after the original monster manual for 3rd edition. Now, as the name suggests, Monsters of Faerun was set in the Forgotten Realms and features monsters unique to the world of Faerun. However, despite uniquely being designed for Faerun, each of the monsters, the main entries for them is relatively setting neutral, so any dungeon master can transplant them to their world, hopefully with minimum work, but with the benefit of adding a lot of lore to the world. Now, I would absolutely love to go through the deep history, the deep lore of the tall mouther, but with its single outing in the book, there really isn't actually much about this gangly, blue-furred tusk gorilla in the book beyond they're considered the quote-unquote natural predators of halflings and mostly found on the borders of the halfling land of Lurelin. I'm going to take this moment right now to apologize for all my pronunciation issues. I'm doing my best. Please bear with me. Anywho. So, with no origin listed for the tall mouther, let alone why they prey upon halflings of all things, one could get away with the stereotypical, hey, a wizard did it and moved on. However, I actually think with those 2 clues, we can actually make a pretty good educated guess about the origin of these giant mouths with equally giant limbs. All right, so let's go over what we know about the tall mouther. First things first, the tall mouther is, despite its nominal bestial appearance, is actually classified as an aberration. A beast classified is a non-humanoid creature that is a part of the natural world, which, just looking at the picture of the tall mouther, I think we can all agree, clearly not that. Part of modern D&D definition, aberrations are unnatural creatures that have no place in the natural order of the material plane, or, for the most part, any of the other known planes of existence. Aberrations typically have no single point of origin, no real kinship or other relation to each aberrant species. Typically, each aberrant species is kind of its own thing, and they're all just kind of grouped together because they don't fit any of the other categories. Some believe that aberrations originate from the Far Realm, which is the frayed edges of the multiverse and the home of psionic powers and eldritch horrors. However, there are some aberrations whose origins are as unique as the creatures themselves. Some aberrations are not said to come from distant lands, but from distant times, such as the Illithids from the far future, or the Aboleths from, well, before everything. There is even wild magic that could have caused it, terrible conflicts. There's even the plane between planes that hide a few twisted creatures that are utterly foreign to the material planes. And finally and frankly, perhaps most importantly for our tale, is that some aberrations are unnatural creations of dark alien deities, or powerful but only questionably moral spellcasters. Like I said, sometimes wizards just can't leave well enough alone. Next, tall mouthers have clearly been around for some time. In fact, I think it's been a long time. You don't become the natural predator to something overnight, especially if that prey can think. Tall mouthers have been around for so long that halflings have actually developed slang related to them. He got mouth is a common way of describing a tall mouther victim. Combine that with the fact that no one remembers where they came from, that suggests that tall mouthers have been around for hundreds of years, if not longer. So, why be the natural predator of halflings of all things? Why not the natural predator of rabbits, squirrels, deer, or I don't know, something that doesn't try to kill you back? Well, you have the traditional hatred between elves and dwarves, giant and dragons, and adventurers in the common sense. The traditional relationship between predator and prey is not something you see associated with the player species in Dungeons and Dragons, especially a classic one like halflings. Gnomes sort of hate goblins, but I wouldn't consider either of them the predator or prey. A predator, by definition, is an animal that lives by killing and eating other animals, and most predators target a very specific prey organism. Somehow, the tall mouther has become specialized in their diet and hunting behavior towards halflings of all things. In the tall mouther description, the blue-headed gorillas are primarily found in the Lyrewood forest, which is pretty easy to see why. The Lyrewood is the original homeland of all three sub-races of halflings in Faerun: the Lightfoots, the Stronghearts, and the Ghostwise. Not only do the halflings live nomadic lifestyles throughout the forest, there's also the nearby small kingdom of halflings known as Lyrin. So really both check out as a great place for the tall mouthers to hang out, since there should be abundance of their prey around. Now, while I'm sure in the very detailed history of the Forgotten Realms, many events probably occurred in the Lyrewood, there is one that I think stands out, in particular for the creation of the tall mouthers, and that is the Hin Ghost War. Long story short, about 1600 years ago in the past of the world of Faerun, a ghostwise halfling cleric named Desva began to lead the ghostwise in the worship of the bloodthirsty god Malar. Amongst the Forgotten Realm pantheon, Malar is the lesser deity of hunting, stalking, bloodlust, as well as bestial savagery, who is all about wanton slaughter and about making one's killing long and bloody. This slaughter and bloodshed isn't for any goal or ambition. It is the goal. It is the ambition. Bloodshed for bloodshed's sake. The worship of Malar consumed the minds of the ghostwise halflings, turning the normally cheerful people into brutal killers that glorified violence and bloodshed. There's something almost 40k, something that reminds me of the 40k, the Warhammer 40k Gods of Chaos, and the corruption that the Gods of Chaos cause to people, twisting their minds, their bodies, and souls. It's sort of similar with that with Malar, because Malar's bloodlust spread throughout all of the Lurwood, causing even the normal bears, wolves, and other predators of the forest become increasingly savage. What's even a little bit more 40k is that the greatest of the Ghostwise hunters, the ones that are the most bloody, the most cruel, the most violent, they found that their bodies and souls twisted into vicious werewolves. Essentially, all the Ghostwise became feral, and as the hunting of lesser animals eventually could not satisfy their bloodlust, the Ghostwise turned to new prey. With their face painted like skulls, the Ghostwise stalked the Lurwood for the other halfling subspecies to prey upon. The descent of the Ghostwise and hunting of halflings led to the Hin Ghost War, a 35-year-long war between the Ghostwise halflings and the allied Strongheart and Lightfoot halflings until the Chand of the Stronghearts slew Dasva. That leads me to my purpose-built predator theory. Here's my theory. I think it was around or a little bit before the Hin Ghost War that the Tallmouthers came into being. Through their twisted worship to Malar, it was the Ghostwise halflings that made a purpose-built predator of halflings to use in their hunts. And because it was so long ago, that's why the origin to where the Tallmouthers originally came from has been lost. So what's my evidence? What's my theory? How can I prove this? My first part of the theory, my first reason for the theory, is that the Ghost War timeframe fits my narrative. I said that the Tallmouthers, their origin had to have been hundreds of years ago. The Lost Mine of Fendelavar adventure takes place in 1491 in Faerun's timeline, which is about as far in the timeline so far that we've seen. The Ghostwise halflings started worshipping in about minus 100 in the time frame, with the actual Ghost War occurring starting about minus 65 in the time frame. Do the math, that is approximately 1,556 years. To me, that seems plenty of time for a bioweapon to be created, yet the secret of their origin lost to time. Especially if the remorseful surviving Ghostwise destroyed all records of their creation and did their best to forget the horrors they did while worshipping Malar. My second reason is, even at a glance, there are aspects of the Tallmouther that are pretty clearly designed to take out halflings. These gangly four-armed monsters are A, faster than a standard halfling. They have far-reaching arms that are 15-foot reach arms, which is absolutely tremendously long reach. But here's an interesting fact. Those far-reaching arms don't have claws that a traditional predator would. Instead, the Tallmouther buffets its prey with its fists, making its killing long and bloody. Now, where have we heard that before? In addition to all that, its arrow evasion even appears specifically designed to go against halflings, since stereotypical halflings are known for their use of ranged weapons like slings or crossbows. Plus, I can only imagine that Malar and the worshippers of Malar are huge fans of the up close and personal. So having the ability to force others to fight you in close range seems ideal. My third bit of evidence is that Ghostwise halflings are a psionic race. Though it's not brought up how or why, the Ghostwise as a whole have the ability to telepathically communicate with any other creature within a certain range. It's even mentioned that it's moderately common for Ghostwise to display more potent psionic powers. When D&D 2024 has a dedicated psionic class, that's where the Ghostwise would end up. I bring up the psionic potency of the Ghostwise for a couple different reasons. First, aberrations, even ones that don't have a connection to the far realm, tend to have a connection to psionic power. There's a claw, there's a tentacle, they have something to do with psionic powers. And psionic powers come from the far realm. This far realm connection is my final reason, my final bit of evidence, specifically the body horror aspect. A common trope amongst Eldritch power is the twisting of flesh into new and terrifying forms. This is something also common amongst the worshippers of Malar, given a number of them have turned into werewolves. Perhaps there was a ritual of Malar that turned someone into a werewolf. Perhaps the Ghostwise got a hold of this. With the Tallmouther being an aberration, often known for their connections to the far realm and not a beast, perhaps the Ghostwise figured out a way to combine this ritual and their psionic power to create these attack animals. And as to what the target of these rituals were, I don't think it was a Ghostwise halfling. I don't think it was a common animal, at least not initially. I think originally, because the Tallmouthers speak a broken version of halfling, I think the Ghostwise took prisoners. Not often, but I think often enough, both before the Hidden Ghost War and afterwards. I think some of those prisoners, those halfling prisoners, were subjected to this ritual that created the Tallmouthers, that twisted the tiny little halflings into these large, gangly blue gorillas. That's my theory, anyway. With the theory of where the Tallmouthers came from, now let's talk about how the Tallmouther can mouth their prey. May I never say that sentence again. The key idea I wanted to keep when transitioning the Tallmouther to the current edition of D&D is that it is a savage, but for the most part, pretty straightforward hunter. Lacking any special attacks or magical capabilities in its arsenal, the CR5 large aberration makes up for that with its many, many arms and its ginormous teeth. I made its bite attack hit pretty hard for a couple reasons. First, given the length of its arms, there's a decent chance it won't be able to use its bite every round. So I thought it should be able to hit hard when it does. And probably more importantly, the bite is its name. It's called the Tallmouther. Its bite should earn the phrase, "he got mouthed." However, with that being said, the bulk of the danger of the Tallmouther comes from its forearms. Their fist attacks don't deal much damage, but their true threat comes from the absurd 15-foot reach. Combined with their impressive speed, there are few things on the ground that are able to keep out of reach of a Tallmouther that's coming after them. Even better, that tremendous reach and huge number of limbs means pain for anything that's going to try to escape the reach of a Tallmouther, because they would have to move out of that 15-foot reach, and it's going to provoke an attack of opportunity. And even if one escapes, provoking that attack of opportunity, if something else tries to escape, the Tallmouther's reactive trait will allow it to get an additional reaction. So you're really not safe once you get within reach of a Tallmouther. These limbs even provide a measure of protection, penalizing any range attack that's targeting the Tallmouther thanks to the whirlwind of limbs whipping around it. Mechanically, that's really about it for these brutal, straightforward creatures. I take that back. I sort of lied. There's actually one more notable thing about the Tallmouther. They're not as dumb as they look. In fact, the Tallmouther is more than a simple beast, or aberration for that matter, due to their intelligence score of 8 and a wisdom score of 10. Normal animals have an intelligence of 3 and a wisdom of 10, give or take. For an animal, a wisdom of 10 really isn't that special. It's about middle of the pack, on par with a crocodile or elk. Way wiser than a goblin. It's the intelligence that's the real notable part here. An intelligence of 8 is on par with the giant eagle or your stereotypical peasant, and most of the other beasts are kind of left in the dust with 1s and 2s, a few 3s there. I bring up the comparison between animals and the Tallmouthers to show that, despite what you might think, Tallmouthers aren't mindless brutes. Brutes, 100%. Mindless, well, While their reasoning and cleverness probably isn't anything to write home about, there is some thinking behind those crazed eyes. Thus, while their bloodlust does take priority about all their actions, they can decide the best manner to get to the chewing. Once initiative dice rolls, a tall mouther wants to get into close combat with as many targets as possible. And they're going to be able to do so with their 40-foot speed and their 15-foot reach. That is 55 feet of threat they are able to produce every round. With range attacks being at disadvantage when you're trying to target the tall mouther, that's going to force most of their prey to get into melee with them, which is exactly where the tall mouther wants them at. Once they do get into melee, the tall mouther will go absolutely wild, beating and chewing on its prey, taking advantage of its multiple attacks. If anything tries to run, it's going to get a fist for its trouble. Anything that does get away can only breathe a temporary sigh of relief because, once again, the tall mouther has a 55-foot threat range. Meaning, if you do run, it's just going to be able to catch you. In my mind, as creatures tied to the goddess savagery, once a tall mouther starts swinging, it doesn't stop until a thud hits the bloody ground. Hopefully, for the adventurers, that's the tall mouther. Besides being a bizarre random encounter for a group wandering through a forest, I think these twisted aberrations have some interesting storytelling potential, particularly when it comes to their mystery as well as my theory about their background. A halfling population could hire a party of adventurers to investigate a tall mouther sighting in the area, hoping to kill the beast before it claims any lives. Once it realizes that it's being hunted, I could see the tall mouther trying to turn the tables and hunt the party right back. While one would think hunting a blue furry gorilla would be relatively easy, tall mouthers are smarter and wiser than your average beast. I could see the tall mouther ambushing the party, or perhaps even making traps to harass and drive them to a pit, a deep pit that the tall mouther can swing down at the edge of it with little that the adventurers can do but try to climb up and just get swatted as they do so. The story could even take a turn towards horror, taking a leaf from the classic werewolf tale. An innocent halfling soul survives an attack with a tall mouther, bitten but otherwise alive, perhaps even saved by the party. They go on with their life until a full moon, or perhaps they just become angry. Whatever reason, their body twists and mutates until they become a tall mouther. Death follows, but then the halfling wakes up as themselves with no memory of what happened, horrified as the rest of the neighbors when they see all the dead bodies that have occurred. And it happens over and over again. The party's brought back to help stop what looks to be a werewolf attack, a tall mouther attack. Either way, it doesn't really add up. Tall mouthers are all taken out in a nearby area by the party, but the attacks keep happening. Perhaps the halfling starts to remember what is happening when they transform. Perhaps the party witnesses the halfling transform. What do? Because it's not the halfling's fault. Can they stop it? How do they stop it? Riffing off that idea, say a friend of the party is captured by those who happen to know the secrets of creating the tall mouther, and they're forcibly turned into it. The party obviously wants to save their halfling friend, so they dive into discovering where the tall mouthers originally came from. By doing so, they risk making enemies of the Ghostwise who want to make sure that the past is forgotten, perhaps even threatening tensions once more between the three halfling people. There could be dungeons to delve of old Ghostwise laboratories and ritual centers full of God knows what that's still in there. Eventually, the party could find themselves going against the machinations and the followers of Malar, trying to find a way to free their halfling friend of the curse of being a tall mouther. A sudden rise of tall mouthers in a forest could actually be like the precursor to the servants of Malar. Kind of like hunting dogs that are running before a hunting party. In this particular case, the servants of Malar are preparing a grand hunt for the ages, not just on those that live in the forest, but in the countryside, the kingdom. The party encounters one of these mouthers and follow where it came from, only to discover the massive hunting party ready to be unleashed upon the world. The party's captured, but they're not killed like you probably would expect, because the servants of Malar, they like to hunt. And in this particular case, we're going to go with a most dangerous game scenario, where before the grand hunt is initiated, the servants of Malar are going to send the party out weaponless, defenseless, into the forest, giving them a little bit of time to run before the servants of Malar go after them. The party's going to have to figure out a way to survive in the forest, knowing that they're being hunted. At the far side of the forest could be a garrison, some sort of defense, some sort of measure of safety, if they can just get there. But that's days away, and they have no weapons, and they're being hunted by a bunch of bloodthirsty, crazed monsters, including the tall mouthers. How does the party survive that? What traps do they lay? How do they ambush? How do they survive long enough to make it to safety? Regardless of how you use them or where they came from, in conclusion, tall mouthers are some old school D&D weirdness. They're like a sort of bloodthirsty half spider, half gorilla aberration that prey upon the smallest of the player races for whatever reason. Also, their name makes no sense. They aren't listed as being very tall. Honestly, they're wide, if anything, due to their huge arms. Their mouth isn't terribly impressive, and frankly, there's a ton of creatures that are way more mouth-focused than these guys. A better name would have been like Bluehead or Longarm. But I love them. Weird mouth, short body, and all. What they don't have as memorable capabilities, the tall mouther more than makes up for that when a giant blue head suddenly comes charging out of the forest, its arms swinging, saying the gosh darndest meanest things in halflings. And I think that's real special. And finally, in the description, I have a link to a monster block stat for the tall mouther updated to 2024 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, ready for you to unleash upon your players. As for a channel update, this marks the second video I've officially put out, so happy to hear any feedback about how they're being received. We here at Tiers of Play are a growing channel, so if you found this interesting, please leave a like and subscribe for all of our future videos. It really does mean the world. Let me thank all of you for your time, and wishing you all the best until we meet again for our next monster.